Spanning the globe, it's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Craig, executive director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and a new season of our World Affairs Roundup. Robert Craig is extending his summer vacation, but our stalwart Roundup regulars John Katzka and Ann Hamilton are rested and ready to jump back into the deep waters of world affairs punditry as we look at Chile in China. In a sideline meeting with Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit in China, described as candid and blunt, President Obama noted gaps of trust in the current U.S.-Russian relationship. What's driving this breach, and how is it playing out in other fora, including the U.S. race for president? Post-Brexit politics. Reports of an uptick in racist violence in the UK following this summer's Brexit vote mirror similar trends elsewhere in the EU. Is this a momentary reaction to the immigration crisis or a deeper shift in attitudes? Tipping point. With senior European officials all but pronouncing the death of the proposed Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, supporters of the even larger Trans-Pacific Partnership face a tough road to approval. Why have multilateral trade agreements fallen on hard times? And Duterte's drug war. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte provoked White House ire when he referred to President Obama as, quote, the son of a whore. Duterte was reacting to criticism of his questionably legal drug war that's generating an alarming body count in his nation. How is his leadership likely to impact an already tense region of the world? Well, welcome back, both of you. Trust you had a restful summer.
Yes.
Very good. Well, let's jump right back into it, John. Talk a little bit about this sideline conversation at the G20 between the president and Mr. Putin.
Candid and what was the other?
Blunt.
And blunt are often terms applied to conversations between us and the Russians. But I'm afraid that in addition to that, we're talking past each other. And part of the problem goes to a number of issues that have become has made the relationship very complex and troubling. History, and we're talking about Russian history, is part of it. The fact that the Ukraine was part of Russia from 1653 on, up until the end of the Cold War, up until the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union. We're talking about the fact that Crimea was always part of Russia, is considered part of Russia, except for what Nikita Khrushchev did for administrative purposes. We're talking about geopolitics. We're not talking about the relationship with Canada or Mexico or Cuba or Panama. We're talking about the relationship of Russia to its neighbors. So that it's their geopolitics. We're talking a little bit about our ideology, and it's mostly our ideology, and that is the idealism of wanting Russia to look more like us. And we're talking about cultural differences. We're talking about the fact that the individual in Russia, whether we're talking about Tsarist, Soviet, or under Putin, is not as important as the group, as the collective. And we're talking about perceived or real threats and attacks. And much of this flows after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as Russia was reeling and we were pushing deeper into Eastern Europe and into the former Soviet Union.
So, Anne, is this an inevitable clash of cultures that would unlikely to be breached, or Let me give you a quote the Secretary of Defense Ash Carter offered recently, saying Russia has a clear ambition to erode the principled international order.
I don't think anything's inevitable in international relations, but I do think that Russia, as John mentioned, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the effect of history, and clearly Putin is trying to reestablish Russia's preeminence on the world stage. And I think there are areas here, and I think they were trying to talk. I know that there's been a meeting going on between Secretary of State Kerry and their Foreign Minister Lavrov. They're trying to make there are areas where they're trying to work together, especially Syria right now. They're trying to figure out some kind of ceasefire that can lead to actual negotiations to end the war. However, it seems that Russia is also at the same time has its geopolitical ambitions, and it's serving Russia well for this war to continue to enhance its interest in the area, working now with Turkey to pull Turkey away from NATO, for example, and trying to work, maybe even carve up Syria in ways that would not be acceptable to the United States. So there are areas where we're trying to work together, where we should be able to work together, but I think all of these negatives that John listed keep rearing their ugly heads.
Well, if we look at just the very narrow issue of Syria, do we have common interest in Syria?
Well, we want to remove Assad and we want to eliminate ISIS. Russia wants to keep Assad for at least the time being, as well as maybe hurt ISIS. So on ISIS, we have some commonality. Regarding Assad, I don't think we do.
No, I don't think we do, and I think that Russia is really trying to use it to, the United States diplomatic efforts there really escalated once Russia started intervening militarily and propping up Assad. So, and I think that we're seeing that as a major threat to our interests, but otherwise we don't have a lot of shared interest there, except the humanitarian interests, which of course everybody has and which is huge.
But I also see we have not had a coherent and consistent policy regarding Syria, and so we leap a little bit and then we pull back, and when we want to reassert the Asia first policy, and then we come back. So our policy has been disjointed in Syria and in the Middle East, partly because I'm not sure we have a goal of what we want to come out of this.
Well, and what about the role of Russian domestic politics? Is Putin vulnerable? There's an election coming up there as well.
Well, he is showing evidence that he is vulnerable. He removed his chief of staff, Ivanov, who had been with him for a long time. He is warring with some of the oligarchs. Sechin at Rosneft is one who is resisting some of Putin's ideas of what they should be doing to support the lack of revenue coming in. He has set up a private protection service attached to the presidency. So there is a whole bunch of things going on. The infrastructure in Russia makes ours look wonderful, but then ours always looked wonderful compared to what Russia had. The infrastructure has never been a high priority.
Well, you referenced sort of the long sweep of Russian history and the Cold War. There was an ideological basis to the Cold War. Arguably, there were two very different views of the way the economy and just the society in general should work. Is there still that sort of diametrically opposed ideological difference between Russia and the U.S. at this point, or is it much more proximate, narrow issues?
Well, certainly within Russia, there's a tendency to always blame anything that happens in Russia on the Americans. The Americans have their hands in everything, even things that we can't even imagine that we could organize. The Russians are sure that we are organizing the various revolutions around the world and all. So John alluded to the communitarian aspect of the versus the individual. I think that's very real. I think that there are very strong cultural differences. I wouldn't necessarily call it ideology at this point.
I agree.
so there's a definite antipathy towards America, but I don't think it's necessarily ideological.
I used ideology on our side in terms of our wanting to transform Russia, and they're reacting to it as well. I mean, a lot of those NGOs that are very active in there are doing the kinds of things that we think are normal, setting up fair and free elections, a free press, all those things that are part of the Western definition. That doesn't flow as well within an authoritarian society like Russia.
Well, let's stay in the region, but move a bit further to the west. Talking a little bit about just the rise of the right wing throughout Europe, or extreme right nationalists. Talk a little bit, first of all, about what happened in Angela Merkel's home state in the German elections this past week.
Well, her party came in third with, I think, something like 19%, and a right-wing party that was just established 3 years ago came in second place, 21%, and then the Social Democrats, something like 30%. So this doesn't bode well. There are going to be elections in Berlin soon, and those are the right wing is supposed to do well in those elections also. So the thought is that it's definitely anti-immigration against Merkel's decision to let in so many immigrants last year, and
but are there
this.
Sort of deeper issues that seem to be resonating around? One of the charges that that party, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, said that Merkel was deaf to the needs of her own people. So this idea that there's an elite somehow that have lost touch with the population, that seems to cut across a lot of borders.
Well,
right?
in fact, I would say we should pull back from right wing because it can also be left wing.
Yes.
And you just touched on what really is the source of the issue, and that is dissatisfaction with the current elites.
So if we look at Hungary, at France, at name it on the continent, there are really ascendant nationalist parties. What are the commonalities between them? I mean, what animates them across borders?
I think what is really driving it right now is the refugee issue, and the feeling on the behalf of most of the countries involved that they are not able to deal with it, afraid of the cultural changes that will occur within their countries, and this is producing a xenophobic and a possibly racist reaction within the countries, but it also can develop into something called anti-globalism and can have serious economic effects for both those countries and for the world.
Well, and is there an economic component to it as well? I mean, you'd be less likely to be concerned about immigrants if you thought there was an economy that could support them,
right,
not at your expense.
Right. Well, I think it's a similar kind of thing as what we're seeing in the United States. Whether or not it's true, there's definitely a perception that the immigrants, especially and the refugees, are taking away jobs, putting a huge strain on resources. If you think about trying to absorb 1 million people without a really good plan, which apparently Angela Merkel did not have a really good plan to absorb them all, it's very, very costly. So you could see why that would get people who might normally be welcoming to several 100,000 maybe, get much more upset. So there's definitely that economic side to it.
Well, if we look at the message being sent to Ms. Merkel and others in kind of the political mainstream, is the effect to pull those mainstream parties or mainstream parties more in that direction?
In Germany's case, there is really no alternative to Merkel at this point. But I can't think that she would not be affected by the climate that's building within the country. And so that I see them pulling back. She has already pulled back in terms of who they're going to take and for how long they can be there. But I can see more of that pullback from that position. So anti-refugee is going to build in this climate. But it also is, the jobs is a big issue in this whole process. And since most of these countries are working with high unemployment rates, that just feeds into this whole process.
Well, we have to take our break, but it's just interesting to see how many parallels between the rhetoric in this current campaign in the United States and these parties there is. So this really is a global phenomenon. Well, we'll continue with more in just a minute, but first we'll take a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to our World Affairs Roundup. We're talking, as usual, with John Katzka and Ann Hamilton. And let's move to TTIP, the beleaguered trade agreement between the EU and the United States. September 23rd, there's supposed to be a meeting of the European Council in Bratislava. What's going to happen there, or what's not going to happen there?
Well, President Obama had hoped to conclude these negotiations before he left office. They've had 14 rounds of discussion since the negotiations opened in 2013. There's still a lot that needs to be decided, and more European officials, including from the major countries, are coming out and saying they consider the negotiations to be pretty much dead.
But at the same time, the EU bureaucracy is proceeding as if this is all going along.
Well, and one distinction we should make between TTIP is it's being negotiated and is not a done deal versus the TTP, the Trans-Pacific large multilateral agreement that has been negotiated. There's an agreement of the draft on both sides. It just hasn't been approved yet. So we're a little bit earlier in the process on this one.
Yes, we are, but my understanding is that President Obama had been hopeful that something could be done even before he left office, which really does not look like it's going to happen. Whereas with the other one, it could, but may not.
So what's the objection in Europe particularly?
Well, let's go back to the last topic we were talking about, and the Brexit in terms of the concerns about migrants and all those sorts of things that are feeding into this process, and they feed into issues like what kind of crops are we going to be sending over to them? What are the environmental concerns that are related to this? But generally, there is an anti-globalization factor in this whole thing that's coming up on the national level that is still not being expressed in the EU itself.
So, what are some of the specific things people object to?
Well, they're concerned, for example, they're very concerned about a dispute settlement mechanism that's built into it, under which corporations would be able to take countries, state governments to court if they felt that regulations in those countries were somehow adversely affecting their profits. That's one of the things that's very controversial. They also are concerned about labor laws, environmental laws, the idea that this has all been sort of dictated by the United States and that our corporations will not pursue regulations that are as strict on environmental issues and labor laws, for example, that they'll have to, on labor laws, things like hours worked per week, for example, maternity leave, all those kinds of things that differ, by which we're different from Europe, and especially environmental issues as well. There are very strong lobbies within, or public groups within Europe that are working against this and saying that their interests are threatened.
There's also the feeling of helplessness on a part of the nation states as they're trying to deal with multinational corporations, and that flows through in this what is called the
ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement.
Right. Indeed. And how do they have any ability to be able to affect the behavior of these multinational corporations? This is a growing issue internationally.
and the fact that the negotiations have been taking place, behind closed doors, so that there's a sense that nobody really knows what's going on, what's been given away in the negotiations. I think that gets people
and
very
some of this
worried.
came out in terms of the reaction in the United States against TPP. In that there was the businesses, the corporations were invited to participate and make presentations, but that this was not an open process.
So, to your point, John, there is a certain echo of the earlier issue of feeling like your life is slipping out of your control and you're being dictated to by external actors and all of that. Interestingly, it seems as if, unlike TPP, for people who are opposed to the TTIP treaty, the United States is seen as the aggressive actor, and things like GMOs in the food supply and all of that is being forced on them. So
another way to look at the two treaties is that I see the European connection, the TTIP, as economically driven, where I see the TPP as more politically. It is an ability, it is an attempt to isolate China in terms of using an economic mechanism, but isolate China in the process.
Well, let's talk about the much storied Asia pivot and what happened recently with regard to the president of the Philippines. Mr. Duterte had some unfortunate things to say about Barack Obama in anticipation of being criticized for his conduct of a drug war. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, the former mayor of Davao on Mindanao Island is a very colorful man. Probably his remark was instantly regretted, but he didn't take it back. In the sense of that the words probably he regretted. It was not the fact that he was criticizing our president. And this is part of a pushback that's occurring as we go about telling countries in Asia what they should be doing in terms of where they should be with the Chinese and how they should be joining together. And he is probably going to be one of the spokespersons for that pushback.
Well, before we get to how this impacts U.S. strategy in the region vis-a-vis China, and talk a little bit about just the scale of this war he's conducting against his own citizens, be they drug peddlers or in some cases not, perhaps.
Right, well, he certainly campaigned as a law and order candidate, and he was very aggressive as mayor of Davao as well. So I think he's been in power for about 3 months, and there have been at least 3,000 killings of people who they allege are drug dealers. Certainly the stories that you read suggest that a lot of these people are, if they're drug dealers, they're very petty drug dealers, and that sometimes guns have been planted on them. And
these deaths are in the main extrajudicial, and it's not like they have trials and are executed. They're pretty much the trial takes place on the street corner.
Right, and people on the back of a motorcycle, or sometimes it's reminiscent of the Mexican drug war, where heads, skulls of people who have been decapitated will appear in different places with warnings on them. So it's very, very ugly. The interesting thing about it is, despite the numbers, despite the extra legality of the whole affair, he's very, very popular. I mean, the polls show that he's got over 80% approval ratings. So
let's go back to the regional level. Then part of that popularity might be the fact that he is presiding over a Philippines that can say no, right?
I don't think that is as important as the fact that the Filipinos were very concerned about the state of law and order within the country, and that they're generally approving of what he is doing. Now, there is another side to this for what we're describing as reprehensible and occasion and possibly innocent people dying in the process. There is also a lot that he is doing in terms of social infrastructure at the same time, whether it's for drug rehabilitation or working within the communities, especially outside of Manila. So he's very important in that respect.
Well, we've got just about a minute left. Let's talk a little bit now about his stance vis-a-vis the Chinese. Now, we've encouraged the other Southeast Asian countries to be much more strident against the territorial claims of the Chinese. Not so much in his case.
Well, first of all, ASEAN is not going to speak as one voice in terms of its relationship with China. At least about a third of them have no issue in the South China Sea, and therefore are not going to confront China over this, and are going to seek bilateral relationships with them. And right now he is playing, what are you going to offer me, China game.
Right, because the Philippines just won the significant ruling from the International Court of Arbitration, and yet he's playing it down to see whether he can get something exactly major investments in, excuse me, in his home state and the like, if he doesn't really pursue the claims vigorously.
So you see any kind of unraveling of Obama's plans for the region then? I mean,
I don't think we've developed those plans yet for the region. I'm still waiting for the Asia tilt.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that. John, Ann, thank you as always to our viewers. We'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,